What causes climate change?
Earth's temperature depends on how much of the sun's energy is absorbed and how much is released. If sunlight hits something light in color, it bounces back into space. If it hits something darker, it becomes heat. Some of this heat also escapes into space. How much escapes depends on the composition of our atmosphere. Gases like methane and carbon dioxide slow the escape of heat. Scientists estimate that a safe level of CO2 is between 300 and 350 parts per million. Today, we're at 415 parts per million.
Are we sure humans are causing climate change?
Yes, scientists can tell where different CO2 molecules come from based on their isotopes. And this proves that much of the new CO2 comes from fossil fuels.
Why do people say the world will end in 12 years?
That number comes from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. In Special Report 15, scientists were asked to model the difference between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming. They found that conditions at 2 degrees would be much worse. The 12-year estimate is based on the report's finding that we must cut emissions in half in 12 years to keep warming below 1.5 degrees. The worst impacts won't hit immediately after 12 years, but if we don't cut emissions by then, we guarantee at least 2 degrees of warming by 2100.
Is 2 degrees really that bad?
2 degrees of warming doesn't actually sound so bad, but that's the average warming. Warming comes in heat waves and gets concentrated in certain places. Some areas will become uninhabitable, creating millions of climate refugees. Warmer air also holds more moisture, and that means more rain in some places and droughts elsewhere. There will be bigger hurricanes and more wildfires. There's been about 1.5 degrees of warming in Australia in recent years, and now the entire country is burning. Slight temperature changes can also have massive impacts on plants and animals. We don't know exactly how much warming it will take to push any given species to extinction. The real problem, though, is that we aren't on track for 2 degrees of warming. We're headed for 3 or 4 degrees of warming. And that would cause unprecedented food and water shortages and massive property losses. Your RRSP or 401k will not survive 4 degrees of warming. Millions of people will die to war, floods, fires, and starvation.
But world governments are fixing it, right?
Nope, not even close. We're barely doing anything. Emissions reached new all-time highs in 2018 and again in 2019, when scientists say they must be falling by 7% every single year. Remember the SR15 report? 1.5 degrees bad, 2 degrees worse? Well, the pledges from the Paris Agreement will put us between 2.6 and 3.2 degrees of warming. But governments aren't living up to those promises, so we're actually heading for 3.1 to 3.7 degrees of warming. And things could get much, much worse if more countries elect climate-denying governments like the US, Australia, and Brazil already have.
So what's a carbon budget?
A carbon budget is another way to measure our emissions problem. Just burning the coal, oil, and gas that is already in production exceeds our carbon budget for staying under 1.5 degrees. And that doesn't include reserves that we've found but haven't yet developed. There's no point in finding more oil and gas if we're serious about our survival. Which sounds crazy, right? What could be more important than our survival?
But aren't we dependent on fossil fuels?
Not really. We can't go to zero emissions overnight, of course. But that doesn't mean we can't phase them out over 10 or 20 years. The technology exists. In cities, we can use bikes and public transit to get around. Some people can drive electric cars. Reducing the amount of meat and dairy we eat will reduce methane emissions, and it's good for our health. We can use heat pumps to heat and cool our homes with less energy and no fossil fuels. If you want to see a full list of solutions, check out Project Drawdown.
What about trees? Can't we just plant a lot of trees?
Planting and preserving mangroves and other trees can draw carbon down out of the atmosphere, but not as fast as we're pumping it out. So we have to reduce emissions for this effect to be useful. Otherwise, it's like trying to mop up a flooded bathroom without turning off the faucet first.
So what should governments be doing?
Everything. There are lots of good policies already in place in some countries. We can make public transit free. We can give loans for retrofitting buildings. We can ban new fossil fuel developments. There's a big debate about whether we need carbon pricing or a Green New Deal. Really, though, this debate misses the point. A Green New Deal is going to need carbon pricing to handle the nitty-gritty that can't be centrally planned. And aggressive carbon pricing is going to require public investment so people aren't left behind by a rapid transition. Climate breakdown has gotten so out of control that we need every tool in the toolbox. So let's just get on with it.
So why haven't we fixed it yet?
When companies like Exxon realized how big a problem they were creating, the first thing they did was hire the same PR firms that claimed cigarettes didn't cause cancer. For decades, oil companies have been telling us everything is fine. And it's an easy sell because people want to believe that everything is fine. Generally, our brains have trouble focusing on problems that are too distant or complex. So we just go on repeating the same dangerous patterns, making deposits in the same banks, voting for the same parties, driving the same vehicles, eating the same foods. All of that has to change, and it has to start now. But your brain prefers to just repeat old habits. We have to break those patterns. Each and every one of us must take some time to reassess our daily lives. What bad habits can you give up? What new activities can you add to your schedule? Many people are already changing their lifestyles. They've stopped flying or given up meat. They're joining climate marches and calling politicians. But we're still moving too slowly. Everything has to change. If you don't think that includes you, then we don't have much chance of avoiding disaster.
What can I do?
To reduce your personal footprint, fly less, drive less, and eat less beef. Meet with politicians. Tell them that their policies are dangerous. Divest from fossil fuels. And pressure your pension plan to do the same. Talk about climate breakdown. Join a climate action group. It's the best cure there is for climate anxiety. You can also follow Climate Pledge Collective for weekly climate challenges.